The biggest problem is failure to investigate. And I understand why it happens because I was a trial lawyer myself. You hear your clients say a lot of nonsense a lot of the times, and you keep hearing the same alibi. I was with my mom or I was with my girlfriend. It's always like these weak alibis, and it's easy to start becoming cynical about it and not checking it out.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Never Settle Mindcast. Got a very special guest today, a friend of mine, unbelievably accomplished colleague, Justin Brooks. He's the co-founder, director of the California Innocence Project. He's been doing that work for the past 20 years here with California Western University. He's passionate. He was a criminal defense attorney before that. He's been recognized as one of the top 100 lawyers in all of California. He was named Lawyer of the Year twice by California Lawyer Magazine, recently named International Lawyer of the Year, and just a tremendous advocate in doing amazing work in the wrongful conviction, exoneration space. It's unbelievable. I'm glad that he's here. Justin, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
No, thanks for being here. I think an appropriate place to start is sort of, before we get into the wrongful conviction work, what led you to get into the law?
That's a question I don't get asked very often. That's a good one. My dad, throughout my childhood, had a lot of different businesses. He was actually a professional tennis player, and then he stopped playing and he started a lot of failed businesses, restaurants, tennis camps, all kinds of things. And every time he had a bankruptcy, it seemed like the lawyers did well and nobody else. And so I was interested in the law. I was interested in business. So I went to business school with the intent of becoming a corporate lawyer. And then my first year crim law professor took my class out to a prison, Lorton Prison in Washington, D.C. And my life changed that day. I'd never seen anything like it. All these, almost entirely Black men locked up. And I started talking to them. They started asking me questions. I didn't know the answers. I said, I'm just a first-year law student. But I started going out to the prison. I started teaching classes there. When I graduated from law school, I got a fellowship at Georgetown Law School to run a prison clinic. And so I started doing criminal defense work and also working in this prison clinic at the same time. And that just put a different direction to my life.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, numerous people are thankful that that happened, obviously, because then criminal defense work's challenging enough. Okay, we have all the things to overcome, but you really went to the extreme. And I think the transition from corporate lawyer to criminal lawyer to then doing death penalty, wrongful conviction work, where in the trial context where I operate, we often feel as if the game's set against us. You're presumed innocent, feels like lip service in most cases, from pretrial motions to the way you get the glare from the jurors during voir dire. And you're in the space where there's already been a guilty plea or verdict that's come down, and all of that gets thrown aside and you still have to climb out. So how did you get started in wrongful conviction and the work with the Innocence Project?
So after working in the DC prisons for a few years and doing criminal defense work in Washington, DC, I got seduced by the world of academia. So I got offered a teaching job in a nice little town in Michigan, in East Lansing, Michigan. And, it was a great job where I could teach first year criminal law. I could buy a nice little Victorian house for $80,000. My kids could walk to school and go safely to a nice little public school in our neighborhood. And so I took that job, and I lasted about 6 months in terms of just teaching. I read one day a story in the newspaper about a young woman, 21 years old, who was on death row, scheduled to be executed. And the article said that she was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. So If you let that sink in for a second, I couldn't comprehend how anybody could be sentenced to death on a plea bargain. You know, as I've said many times, it's a plea, but it's not a bargain.
No.
There's no way that anything was negotiated. Otherwise, she would have had a lesser sentence. So I went out and met with her on death row in Illinois, drove out there. And she told me that her lawyer told her best opportunity was to plead guilty. And she said, but she's innocent. I said, you're innocent? And you pled guilty and you got the death penalty? Yes. So I went back and told my first year crim law students that story. Said, who wants to help me out on this case? And 4 students raised their hands. And for me, the Innocence Project was born that day. We sat in my kitchen and went through all the paperwork, all the pleadings. We went out to the crime scene and investigated it. We tracked down witnesses, and we discovered she was, in fact, factually innocent. And there was this other woman who had killed these 2 men. I was able to get her death sentence reversed within a couple of years. And it inspired me to start the project. I saw the value in both the service you could provide these innocent people in prison, but also the amazing training it was for these students to work firsthand on a case, to be doing field work, to be interviewing witnesses. So I moved to the belly of the beast, California, the largest prison system, you know, in the United States, in the country with the largest prison system in the world. California's got the largest prison system in the United States. It has 3 strikes, mandatory minimums, death penalty. It had everything in terms of issues to look at in the criminal justice field. So with that, I started the California Innocence Project 20 years ago with another professor at California Western School of Law, a guy named Jan Stiglitz. And I've been running it ever since as director.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I mean, I want to talk about some of the 3 main missions, right? As I understand them, talking with you and looking at the California Innocence Project, because we have a lot, obviously, in common, and we see things a lot. We say things the same that I didn't know that you said, and it made me very happy about, like, the medical school model and the mission being obviously get innocent people out of prison and correct wrongful convictions, with step 2 being training, right? Lawyers, young lawyers and law students to handle, I think you said, criminal cases from the ground up, from investigation, reviewing pleadings, and then obviously going along to the 3rd one being policy changes or law changes. And you've had success in all 3 of those things. It only makes sense to me, the medical school model, right? Where you require people, and that's been my biggest issue with coming out of law school and then seeing in one little context the screw-ups of other lawyers that think any day of the week, with the exception of like the patent bar, where you need a special admission, you can come out, it's pretty scary. And if you have the people that are going to pay you, you could take an accident case one day, criminal case the next, a med mal case the next day, a landlord-tenant issue the third. That's just mind-boggling to me. And it's why people get lawyers confused, I think, because if you break your arm, unless I'm mistaken, you're not going to run to the dentist, right? And so that practical approach, I think, is invaluable. What led you to make that a priority in implementing that through the Innocence Project?
You know, I think coming out of law school and not having that training, I dove into the deep end of the pool as a criminal defense attorney. When I got out of law school, you could be on the panel and receive criminal cases with no experience. So, and in DC, you're going up against federal prosecutors. I was on the panel because it's not a state, and you have this weird sort of state-federal thing going on in DC. So day one as an attorney, I'm sitting in there with my little manual trying to figure out how to do an arraignment, how to do a prelim, what motions to file. And I'd taken criminal law, criminal procedure, trial practice, but nobody ever told me about sentencing or plea bargaining or pretrial motions or any of this stuff. And so, I realized as a lawyer that there was deficiency in legal education. And as a professor, I've seen this throughout my whole career. There's sort of a tension between, law schools not wanting to be seen as trade schools and more of this sort of academic pursuit. And I think it can be both, You teach people to think and teach people to read and to think like judges and have that sort of high level learning going on. But at the end of the day, it's a profession that requires skills. And, it may not be plumbing, but just like plumbing, you need to have some skills on. And if you have never worked with an actual pipe and you're just learning about plumbing from books, you're going to do some pretty bad plumbing. And I think it's the same thing with lawyers, and we've always accepted it with doctors. It just is very obvious to us that nobody wants to go to a doctor and the doctor say, "You're my first patient." Yet we do that with lawyers. We set them out loose, and they haven't, and like you said, they haven't even specialized, because law school is a general law degree where you take courses in contracts and property and torts and evidence, and students mostly self-direct their curriculum. So it's really a strange profession that way, that falls out of sync with a lot of other professions. And I'm a huge believer that, we got to teach them how to think, and we got to take smart people, and they got to be great writers and have all these academic qualifications. But at the end of the day, they got to be able to stand up and make an argument. They got to, if you're a criminal lawyer, they got to understand how to do crime scene investigation. They've got to know how to communicate with real people. And I think sometimes law school actually unteaches that, where people, before they go to law school, they can just talk to regular people. And then they get out of law school and they're talking a lot of technicalities and citing a lot of case law and statutes. And that makes them not as good as a trial lawyer, because ultimately, you have 12 regular people sitting in that box you got to convince of something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in practical education.
Yeah, no, and I couldn't agree more with that point. I mean, I knew pretty early on I wanted to go into criminal work, and so I tried to tailor my education to that, and then link up with people who were respected in the community and do whatever I could to intern with them. I wasn't even worried about getting paid. Just wanted to follow them around because I'd never been to a courthouse before. How do I file things? And so I just literally offered to just do whatever this lawyer, who ended up being my partner later, needed. I said, look, I'll come here as long as I'm not in your way. I just want to learn where things go and how you file things and how you get into the jail. And I didn't realize how weird that was at the time. But none of my friends were doing it. Everyone was trying to figure out what's the highest paid summer associateship I can get. And they had no interest in actually learning the nuts and bolts. So that's one thing that I think was really critical with the California Innocence Project, is people get to touch real cases. They're not made up fact patterns for pretend competitions. These are real lives. In transitioning into the real lives, you guys get thousands of applications requesting case reviews a year, right, to the California Innocence Project, and successful outcomes of that. I think you said the latest number is 34 people you've walked out of prison.
34, yep.
Which, people who are listening to this who don't understand that 34 is an enormous number. I mean, the amount of lives changes. And statistically, it may not seem that way, but it is. So how do you, with your mind, how do you stay focused? How do you keep pushing when, you never settle? You keep pushing, you keep moving forward. Like, what's your trick to keeping motivation and keeping the goal in sight?
Yeah, it is hard, especially considering what you said, that we do look at thousands of cases a year. So we have a whole process where letters come in from inmates, and we send out questionnaires, and we get copies of all their briefs, and we evaluate them. And I have a team of law students to do that, a team of lawyers, lots of volunteer lawyers that screen these cases and look for the needle in the haystack, which is not necessarily that it's an innocent person, because we know there's a lot of innocent people we can't help, but it's someone we believe is innocent and we believe we can develop the evidence to prove it. And that's the hardest part of the work, is finding those cases, because we're the end of the line. We get the cases after they've lost their trial, lost their appeal. And now if we can't come up with something really good, we can't get the case reopened, and we have the burden of proof.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of bad days. Twice a week, we have these sessions where students present cases, and I've got this awful Caesar-like power of thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether the case gets closed. And sometimes I just sit there and think, oh, if I could just get into a time machine and go back to this trial and say one thing to this trial lawyer, this case could have gone differently. But that's not enough to get the conviction reversed. That stuff was missed, that questions weren't asked, that certain people weren't called as witnesses. It's got to be new evidence, and it's got to be extremely powerful. So it's that's the hardest thing. Is I know, even though I've had the joy of 34 people walking out of prison, and as you said, it's not just about those 34 people, it's about their family, their friends, their community. It's about the victims when we follow up and find the right person. It's about the community being safer if that's what happens, that there's actually, we've taken the innocent person out of prison. And for example, right now there's a homicide case going on in Riverside where we exonerated our client, Horace Roberts, and now they're prosecuting the actual guys who committed the crime, who were out on the street for decades while our client was sitting in prison. So there's good days, and then there's a lot of hard days. I've got a hard day today, to be honest. I'm preparing as soon as I'm done talking to you for an en banc parole hearing where our client, Joanne Parks, who's been in prison forever for this murder of her children that she didn't commit. That was the result of an accidental house fire. And we got the governor to grant her clemency, to reduce her sentence and make her parolable. We got the parole board to grant her parole. We all celebrated. And then last week we got a notice that they're having an en banc review of it. So sometimes it seems like it never ends because the process is so long. But the nice thing is, every single year I get a group of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to go law students who are not cynical, who are optimistic, who are energetic, and they keep boosting me up. And I'm lucky I've also got a team of lawyers who work with me who all but one was one of my former students, that are just an amazing team of talented people. And I don't think I could have done this alone for the past 20 years, but doing it within a team has made it a lot easier to bear.
Yeah, no, those are great. Those are great points. I mean, the Innocence Project is a very powerful recruiting tool for talented law students to become interested in Cal Western. For example, my assistant, that it was the main reason that she's at Cal Western now. Her name's Yomira, and she's very passionate about criminal justice reform. I'm sure she wrote about it in her application to get into the law school, and she's in law school now. And she was like thrilled that I was going to be having you on, because she's very passionate, and they have to go through your scavenger hunt. You guys are still doing that, I take it, to get people, make sure that they have the skills and the determination to investigate and turn in their application, I think is great. With all the work, we do and you do, right, from the trial level and then now what you're doing on the post-conviction level, what are some of the main reasons that you see, commonalities that you see, why innocent people end up in prison? And I know a couple, if you want me to give you a start, but I know we have huge identity issues with, cross-racial identification is notoriously terrible, but effective with juries, but scientifically terrible, DNA, there's a number of things. But I want, in your work, when you review these cases and you see them and you're able to sort of point these mistakes out, what jumps out at you?
Well, first of all, and you know this as well as I do, working in the criminal justice system, there's sort of the systemic stuff like systemic racism, poverty. There's no doubt that these cases more impact people of color and people without resources, because they're less likely to be successful in fighting their cases through the criminal justice system. So the majority of the cases we get are people of color and almost all, I don't think I've had a client who had any resources in 20 years. So it starts there, but then the more specific that you can really get a handle on and do something about are things like identification problems. And as studies have been done on people who are exonerated, we've learned that that's one of the leading causes of wrongful conviction in America is bad IDs. And there's a simple answer as to why, and then there's very complex answers. The simple answer is it's very powerful evidence to jurors when somebody walks into court and says that's the person who committed the crime, and points at them. Jurors consider that enough to convict you. And we've seen that happen many times. An ID, boom, no other evidence, convicted. But we now know, after studying identifications for the past couple of decades, that this is not good evidence. It's riddled with problems. And it starts with the fact that people don't have very good memories, and then that memories can be distorted. There's all kinds of contamination when people talk to other witnesses, or the police feed them information, or they watch news stories. And we see witnesses sort of evolve in the process from, at the crime scene, they don't know much at all. And then later on, the person the jury sees is this person who's confident that's the person.
Yeah.
So we've been working a lot on reforming these processes. And we finally got a bill passed in California that gets rid of, these old processes of 6-pack photo arrays, where police officers are sitting there with the person saying, hey, take a look at these 6 photos. We think it's one of them. Is the person here? And all this suggestibility that goes into the process. We try to make the procedures double blind, so nobody in the room knows who the suspect is. We try to reduce the influences. We try to give witnesses instructions of, hey, the person may not be here. We're not saying the person's here. But all that can do is really mitigate the problem. There's still the fundamental problem that memory isn't great, and people make a lot of mistakes with IDs. And as you mentioned, and one of the worst is cross-racial identifications. In my experience, they're almost always wrong.
Yep.
It's just that people are not good at identifying people not of their own race. And it's nothing to do with racism. It's to do simply with exposure, particularly at an early age. We develop our ability for facial recognition in the first 4 years of our lives. And if mom is white and dad is white and your brother's white and your sister's white, your software doesn't get developed to identify well people not of your own race. And it's just a scientific fact. But I think lawyers aren't comfortable talking about race issues. I mean, we're not comfortable in this country talking about race issues.
That's true.
So this is what happens. The jury just buys into it. The person looks pretty sure, and the jury wasn't there, and okay. So we've seen a lot of problems with that. We've seen problems with false confessions. So we've fought hard to have confessions recorded, so we know exactly what was said in those processes. We've got a big problem with snitch testimony. In California particularly, jurors don't understand that people, when they're facing a third strike, or maybe they just want better housing, or maybe they just want some food, or visit with their girlfriend, will just make up testimony. And a lot of people are in prison just on false testimony by snitches. And then we have all these scientific problems that we've been fighting against. Shaken baby syndrome science. We've found a lot of holes in it where they're not cases of abuse, they've been misdiagnosed. Arson science. In the past, it was mostly firemen who were testifying that really didn't understand the science of fires. Bite mark testimony. These guys who claim to be forensic odontologists when they're really just bored dentists who love CSI. There's a whole host of it. So there's a lot of causes of wrongful convictions. The reason that motivated me to write a textbook on the topic, and I teach a course specifically just focused on the causes of wrongful conviction, and I lecture about it around the world, because people have to understand that cases can be presented and have massive holes in them that we don't see.
Yeah, well, shout out to you, because I think you have the only law school textbook on wrongful convictions. I think it's in the 3rd edition now. So thank you for that and spreading that message. But let's get back to the bored dentist who likes CSI, because that's a true thing, and these people feel special doing it. But you specifically had at least one of your innocent clients was sent to prison in large part because of a forensic odontologist who screwed up the bite mark analysis, right?
Yeah, ours became one of the most famous cases on the topic. It was our client's Bill Richards was living with his wife out in San Bernardino. They were building a home out in the middle of the desert. And he came home one night and he found her beaten to death in front of the trailer where they were living. He called the police. Nobody came. He called them back again. He flashed his headlights. They came and did some of the worst crime scene work I've ever seen. They actually left her body out overnight, didn't secure it, and some dogs started to bury her body after the police had been there. They didn't do any kind of time of death analysis, really did no police work. And when they couldn't find another suspect, as what often happens, the person who finds the dead body, particularly if they're in a relationship with that person, becomes the prime suspect. So they went after our client. They tried him multiple times, got hung juries. And then they brought in this forensic odontologist who claimed that a bite mark on her body matched my client, and he gets convicted on that. Years later, I actually got together with this expert, called him up, and he was the prosecution's expert. And I said, I want you to look at the evidence that we're looking at here, because first of all, these photos are shot at the wrong angle. So I don't know how you made a conclusion that there was a match. And when we've had these photos adjusted for the angle, it shows that it's an exclusion. So I sat down with him. I met him, I remember, it was many years ago, at Extraordinary Desserts in Little Italy, not far from your office there.
Yep.
And he looked over him and he said, "You guys are right. I should have never testified this way." And his testimony was very powerful. This guy is one of the leading experts in the world on forensic odontology. He was like head of the International Forensic Odontology Organization, and jurors hear that stuff and they eat it up. And so we actually had him come back in and recant his testimony in our hearing, which was very extraordinary to have the prosecution's witness come in and say, "I got it wrong. This isn't a match."
Extremely rare.
Very, very rare. I mean, most times you don't even make that phone call to them, let alone get them to come back into court on your behalf.
Yep.
So he does the right thing. And we had a tough on crime former prosecuting judge out there in San Bernardino, which is never promising. And he reversed the conviction. It goes up to the Court of Appeal, and they reverse the reversal, saying that experts cannot recant their testimony, and you claim that their original testimony was false. We then take it up to the California Supreme Court, and we lose 4-3 on the same idea, saying, well, experts, there's different experts have different opinions, so they can't come in and change it. And I'm thinking, this isn't different experts saying different things. This is the same expert. So in other words, a regular citizen could walk into court and say, when I identified Jason in that case 5 years ago, I was actually wrong. It was someone else. That would be okay. That's considered false evidence, and we could raise that in a habeas petition. But they said because he's an expert, he can't do that. So after losing the California Supreme Court, we went to the legislature, and we actually got a law passed saying expert testimony can be deemed false if it's later recanted by the expert with a basis for it. And then we went back to the California Supreme Court and finally won. It was 15 years of litigation and fighting for legislation. I love to use it as a teaching model for my students because it's sort of, when all else fails, go get the law changed. Like, don't give up. If you feel you're righteous and you got an innocent person, find a way.
Yeah, and you've heard it plenty of times, but congratulations to you guys in that team effort that spanned a decade and a half, because Mr. Richards' case is a phenomenal one. You have all of them are phenomenal because none of them are cookie cutter. Even the short ones, it's never cookie cutter. But that one touches all three of the missions of your Innocence Project. You got an innocent person out of prison. You had law students, 15 years worth, come in contact with that case at least, and then on the back end to finally get goal number one, getting the innocent person out, you had to get the law changed, which is head scratching to me because it only makes sense that an expert should be able to do that because they're the ones that can interpret new evidence and can render an opinion. And it's so rare because we all know the hired gun paid experts. And even if you get somebody off the record to say, hey, yeah, maybe that's not right, ego and future business and all these other personal interests of that individual come into play. And to have that phone call with the prosecution's expert and get them to recant, look at the new evidence, and then say, my opinion would have been the exact opposite. we don't have enough time in this week to talk about the Herculean effort that is to get that to happen, because the workup and the buildup. But Mr. Richards' case is just a phenomenal one to me from a lawyer looking at it on the outside and knowing what your missions are, because it highlights the sort of the three-headed monster of the Innocence Project that's out there fighting these battles every day. I wanted to ask you, because people always think you're crazy because of the work that you do. But I confirmed how crazy you were when you were talking about doing these walks, and you walked 712 miles from San Diego to Sacramento to hand deliver 12, was it clemency petitions, the California 12 to Governor Jerry Brown at the time? How was that process? And what shoes did you wear?
Well, what shoes did I use? Oboes, really great long distance walking shoe. Although, funnily enough, they wore down on the tar, and when I brought them back to REI, they said, there's no shoe made for walking 700 miles on hot concrete. Like, no one does that. So there's nothing we can do for you. But anyway, so yeah, I got into filing clemency petitions a little more than 10 years ago. Clemency petitions are sort of the last hope. But the problem with them there's so many problems. They're very politicized. And in a state like California, the largest state in the country, it's very hard to get the governor's attention. I mean, I talk to people who do this work in places like Rhode Island, and they say, oh, when I want to meet the governor, I just go down to the diner and he's always in the last booth and we just have a chat. I'm like, that's not California. This is a country. I mean, California is the 6th largest economy in the world. It's not like a state. And so I filed these clemency petitions, but I thought, no one's going to pay attention to these because everybody files them. There's hundreds of thousands of people that are incarcerated, and even people who aren't incarcerated trying to clear their records that can be potential people filing these. So to get the governor's attention, I came up with this crazy idea that I would walk the clemency petitions from my office in San Diego to Sacramento and try to get as much attention to that along the way. Why was this crazy law professor walking across the state? And when I told my staff about it, a little part of me thought, oh, they'll talk me out of this. But then they said, no, that's a great idea. You should do that, boss. And then 2 of them volunteered to walk with me, Mike Samanchik and Alyssa Biracall. And we spent 50 days walking across the state. And man, it was just getting across Camp Pendleton is a hard walk.
Yeah.
And there's no legal way to do it. So we were walking on highways, we were walking on railroad tracks. We thought we could do it in 500 miles, but the only way to possibly do it ended up being 712 miles. And but we talked at schools along the way and community centers and had media following us. We had a giant press conference in the Santa Monica Pier when we were there. We had like every bit of LA media there. And as a result of that press conference, we got a meeting with the governor's staff to present the petitions. And it started this, decade-long, I guess it's been 8 years now, odyssey of fighting those cases. It started this decade-long battle to win these cases. We kept fighting them in court at the same time we were fighting for those clemency petitions. So we've won some of those 12 cases in court and freed them. Guys like Mike Handline, who spent 36 years in prison, we got him out through the court processes. And then we've also won some of these clemency petitions. We've actually, we're on the verge of freeing the 10th one of the 12. So it's been a minute. It's been a journey, but again, it just fits exactly with what I've spent my career doing, just uphill battles, whether it's walking across the state or continuing these appeals or whatever it is. We don't give up on these cases.
It's amazing. And, I'm always, it's funny. I'm just in such awe of the work that you guys do, honestly, practicing at the trial level in that, right? I did both state and federal court. Most of my practice now for the last probably 6-7 years is exclusively almost federal court, with a handful of former clients or personal referrals that take me over to the state side every now and then. And I know how hard that process is. But then when I look at the success you guys are having and the efforts you're putting forth, it almost makes me makes me feel in a way like, God, I'm inadequate. I'm not doing enough. But it's, we all have our part to play, but it's just very admirable to see year after year after year, these great results eventually are coming, and it's not by the payoff or who it's legit through hard work and complete dedication to your clients. What do you think, sort of a couple questions I have is like, what do you think the biggest change we need to see in the prison system, in the warehousing? Because we have the largest prison population in the world. California is the state with the most incarcerated inmates. And there's never enough emphasis to me on rehabilitation, addressing underlying issues, mental health, cognitive behavioral therapy, whatever it is, to address the underlying issues or circumstances to get to eliminating recidivism or at least lowering it. What do you think, in your perspective, is one change that we could try to make on the sort of sentencing aspect or warehousing of these individuals to help lower recidivism and sort of better the outcomes in the future?
So as I talked about earlier, I spent 3 years working the prison in DC. I was teaching law classes. I was helping guys file habeas petitions. And also my wife and I started, along with a professor at Georgetown, the first prison family literacy program, I think in the world, at least in the United States. And we would teach the inmates how to teach their children to read. And then once a week, we have all these buses pick kids up all over DC, and we bring them to the prison. And we'd have these dads, and we did it with moms as well, sitting down and teaching their children to read. And the whole idea of the program was to create a positive connection between these parents and their children, to have the parents have a sense they could give something to their children, and to break down the cycle of illiteracy within these families. I think we need to rethink completely prisons and what we're accomplishing and what we're not accomplishing, what we're thinking about as priorities and what we're not thinking about. For example, in California, we build these prisons out in the middle of nowhere, wherever land is cheap. And we don't give a thought to the fact that these prisons are hundreds of miles away from where the families of these people locked up are. We don't concern ourselves with that because it's not important. But if we really looked at it broadly and looked at the societal impact of criminal justice and prisons, we'd know that that's a terrible model, because guys come out of prison completely disconnected from their families. It means they're more likely to reoffend. It means they're less likely to be able to get back into a normal life. And the same thing to do with prison programming. We don't think, how can we get this person back to a place, or to a place for the first time in their life, where they can adjust to society, follow society's rules, be successful. We're so focused on punishment and policies of revenge that we've created this monster. And it really is a monster. I mean, the fact that the United States locks up not just the greatest total number of people in the world, but the highest incarceration rate in the world is a disgrace. I mean, how is it possible, when crime is directly connected with economics, that the wealthiest country in the world locks up more of its population than anyone else? That doesn't make any sense. And it only makes sense when you look closer at it and you see what our policies have been for the past 30 years. We've fought this war on drugs that has been fruitless, that has just cost us billions and billions of dollars and all these lives, and is a total failure. We've ramped up our punishment levels so that we have the highest ones in the world, so that we have these octogenarians pushing brooms around the yard in the prisons, and we're paying for their health care and for wheelchair ramps to be put in, and these people don't pose any risk to society. We really need to start at a base level. And I think if we start by doing things like lowering sentences, only incarcerating people who've committed violent crimes. Like if we only incarcerated people who did violent crimes, we could immediately decrease the population by 50% in prison. That's literally, we save hundreds of billions of dollars by doing that. And if we have those resources now freed up, it's, well, what can we do with those resources? We could turn the prisons into trade schools, into places that are focused on education and jobs, and on giving people therapy and dealing with their underlying issues, so that when they're released, And that's the thing too, is it's almost a fantasy. Like, we're going to put them in prison, we'll never see them again. But the truth is we are. And so we have to address it. So I don't know, we don't have enough time to talk about the hundreds of ways to do it. But I think we start with changing our philosophy, thinking of ways to free up resources, and then using those resources in an effective way. But the problem is politicians benefit from tough on crime policies. They get reelected on it. And then they get the side benefit of money from the corrections industry, support from the correctional officers union, support from the police officers union, support from the prosecutors. So this whole machine just keeps going and feeds itself. And until the citizenry looks beyond the 30-second TV commercial that tries to scare them into tough on crime policies, we won't see those changes. It's going to take all of us to rise up against this, because it's basically been a conspiracy between politicians and the corrections industry that has really benefited from 30 years of what I think is terrible, terrible criminal justice policy.
I have nothing to add to that. That was perfectly said, in the sense that, getting back to the economic point, you got to it at the end with, we're a wealthiest nation, and that's the link to criminal activity in almost every situation. But then we see why there's no incentive for the policies to change, because of the political funding that goes into it. And then the billion-dollar industry annually that is the privatization of warehousing of individuals, or the private prison system. And then you get into another can of worms with all the civil rights and human rights violations that go on within those facilities, with lack of care. And then the line that we all hate to hear in this world, and our clients hate to hear too: well, if you don't like it, don't come to prison. Which is, like, to me, the most bullshit line I think that gets thrown around with this. They don't treat the clients as or inmates as humans, right? Their numbers and their files, and we could go on and on about that, but I think they need to do a more intelligent review of the sentencing schemes in this country. They're draconian. The war on drugs failed. The mandatory minimums don't make any sense. And until, sadly, in my personal experience, until somebody is affected by these policies, whether they become a client, a friend, family member, or someone they know, then all of a sudden this thing needs to change. This thing is a problem. And it shouldn't have to get there for people to become interested and really see that tough on crime is a bumper sticker, right? And tough on crime means usually terrible on education, because we're spending all this money on these failed crime policies that come out of other budgets that could be going to make a better society, that would cause less issues with the citizenry being better equipped to earn a living and go into trades or fulfill their life, and have the skills, both emotional, psychological, and educational components to make a life and a living in a very expensive place in the world. And there's less incentive for crime, and a lot of people don't peek behind the curtain to sort of see the interweb or the play between this. Conspiracy is a perfect word for it, that often gets labeled as if we're being conspiracy theorists, but it's an interplay of
it's just business and politics. Yeah. Again, I don't think you have to be a conspiracy theorist to just see how obviously it evolved. I mean, yep. I always go back to Willie Horton. Willie Horton is maybe the most important person in criminal justice in the last 50 years. And he was a guy in Massachusetts who was out on parole and committed a murder. And when Mike Dukakis was running for president against George Bush I, Mike was way ahead leading into the last days of the election campaign. And George Bush, someone in his campaign, came up with a brilliant idea, which was Mike Dukakis, as governor of Massachusetts, is responsible for all parolees. So let's run an ad campaign saying about how he's soft on crime because he lets murderers out of prison. And George Bush won the election. Every politician has learned from that in the last 30 years. Do not come across as soft on crime, no matter what. There's no benefit to it. And then, like I said, and the other added benefit is, by the way, you will get all this other support for being tough on crime, like the Correctional Officers Union, which is now the second most powerful union in California, police officers unions, all these people that support those policies. No downside. So it doesn't take any conspiracy theories. It is this sort of, a conspiracy in the sense of they all together are furthering the building of prisons and the expansion of sentencing. And then you have corporations involved, like you said, the private side of it. You have Correction Corporation of America, which is a corporation that builds prisons. That's their business. And the New York Times actually did an article that the Correctional Corporation of America was behind Arizona's new tough immigration laws because, now the business is immigration detention facilities. So business is going to move where business is good. And when business isn't good, they create more business. And everybody can do it with very righteous language saying, we got to protect society. I don't think it takes any kind of leap of anything to see exactly what's happening. But again, like you said, you and I have had a front row seat to this because we sit in courtrooms and we see these sentences and see our clients in prison and see the impact on the families. But prisons are designed to hide this problem away. Criminal justice system's designed to hide this problem away. So yeah, the average American, until they do get a family member caught up in it, doesn't take much interest in it, just hopes, just thinks this doesn't even impact me. This is bad people. That's bad people, what happens to them. And whatever
Only
happens to them is
happens to
fine
bad
'cause they're
people.
bad.
Yeah, only happens to bad people and guilty people, apparently. So one other question I have too, that I think would be very beneficial to listeners, and I obviously have a personal interest too, is taking the post-conviction perspective. What's one piece of advice that you would give to trial lawyers? You mentioned earlier, I wish I could tell these lawyers in certain cases to ask this question because you're locked into the record and we don't have those answers, and obviously that would be material to any sort of petition for relief. But do you have a piece of sort of general advice, even a top 3, that you would give for trial lawyers in the criminal setting that are handling these cases to preserve the record or to do the best that we can for our clients, and in the event we come in second place, what you guys are left with a better record to assist if possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got some advice on that. So first of all, we have the best trained lawyers in the world, the United States, if you look at education. In most countries, it's an undergraduate degree. Everywhere I work in Latin America, where I do a lot of lawyer training, it's an undergraduate degree. And to compare, for example, Mexico has more than 2,000 law schools. The United States has 200. So it's undergraduate, and they don't have a bar exam. They don't have a lot of things we've put in place here. So we've put a lot of stuff in place here where we limit the training to very few number of universities. We put very high standards on those universities in terms of the training they have to give. We give this very difficult bar exam. We fund an office to investigate us. I remember telling a bunch of judges in Mexico about the California bar and how I pay $500 a year for an office to potentially investigate me and other lawyers. And they said, "Why would you do that?" And I said, "Because I want high standards in our profession." So we have lawyers that are incredibly well trained. And so what I don't see is a lot of tremendous litigation mistakes, right? Like I see in Mexico. I mean, you can sit in a courtroom in Mexico right now, and they now have mandated trials, and the judge will say, "Are you ready to do your opening statement?" And the lawyer will say, "What's an opening statement?" Because they haven't figured out how to operate within their system yet. And I had the same thing. I worked in Chile 25 years ago and trained the first 12 Chilean public defenders. And it was the same thing down there as they were figuring out their system. So I don't see that as the big problem. The biggest problem is failure to investigate. And I understand why it happens, because I was a trial lawyer myself. You hear your clients say a lot of nonsense a lot of the times, and you keep hearing the same alibi. I was with my mom or I was with my girlfriend. It's always like these weak alibis, and it's easy to start becoming cynical about it and not checking it out. But for example, Rafael Madrigal, my client, spent many years in prison because his lawyer didn't go to the factory where Rafael said he was working at the time of the shooting. And if the lawyer had gone there, he would have found his time cards where he punched in and out, 10 witnesses who declared that he was there. And most importantly, he would have talked to the head of the factory, who we had testified in federal court, that Rafael was the only person who knew how to use this piece of laminating equipment on the assembly line. And if he hadn't been there that day, the whole assembly line would have shut down. But instead, Rafael gets convicted of this shooting that happens more than 30 miles away There's no evidence connecting to him to it except for a photo ID done by a photo taken when he was a teenager, and he was almost 30 at the time of the crime, by a white woman, and he's Mexican. So based solely on that ID, he goes to prison, but his lawyer never checked out his alibi. So I know lawyers are overworked. I know criminal defense work is really hard. I know, but we got to find ways to figure out these stories and to check them out. And even if 99 of them are terrible, that one that isn't, it's the difference between an innocent person going to prison probably for the rest of their life or not. So that's why I spend so much time with my students, training them on investigation and training them on following up stories and how to do it efficiently and effectively and get to the truth quickly. Because you don't have all day and you don't have forever. And it's not like TV where you're going to spend the next 6 months investigating one criminal case. But failure to investigate, at least from the lawyer's side, is the number one reason. And the other part of that too is failing to get expert witnesses to counter the government's story. I think lawyers sometimes think they know, more than they know. And I try to teach my students just enough to be able to read a report or understand about enough about a science to know to call an expert.
Yeah.
So I say, you'll never be an expert, but know enough to know when to call an expert and check out the government story and the government's expert.
Yeah, that battle of the expert is always critical, because in juries, after trials, we hear that they put extra reliance on these expert testimonies. And if you don't have a good counter expert, and even I found in trial work that I get an expert, even on appointed cases, we apply for the funding, we get an expert, and I don't necessarily always call that expert, but using them to consult and analyze the government's claims for a more effective cross-examination, right? And then we always have the decision whether we're going to put on a case and if we're going to have that expert testify. But I mean, I see it a lot of times where lawyers don't even go through that step. Or what do you need an expert for? Because perhaps they sort of take the expert from the government's report at face value and maybe don't see ways to challenge it. I don't know what it is, but I think that one person where that story checks out, at least for me, is the reason why I got into criminal defense work. I think if you're in it for the other 99, you probably should be a prosecutor, right? Because our job is to really do everything we can to prevent an innocent person from going to prison. And in the event that happens, thank God we have an innocent project like yours. Quickly, you've done, I don't want to brush over the Latin American work, but you've been very active there too. I think you've started over 25 innocence projects in Latin America, as well as you want to update us. I think you got a grant recently because of the mandated trials in Latin America, to start training effective oral advocacy of the lawyers in Latin America.
Yeah, San Diego is, one of the things that really attracted me coming to San Diego was I went to high school in Puerto Rico, and I've always been part of the Latino community, and it's always been a big part of my life. And, ever since I've been in San Diego for the past 21 years, I've been very involved in cross-border stuff. And Cal Western is the perfect law school to do stuff like that, because since we're a small independent school, they often go along with my crazy ideas. So, for example, we're the only school in the United States, except from Puerto Rico, that offers a full degree in Spanish. So we have a 1-year LLM, master's degree in litigation, taught completely in Spanish. And we do it online with lawyers all over Latin America. We also run all of the Mexican national moot court competitions out of our law school. And it's a grant that I got from the State Department a number of years ago. And we every year run regional competitions all over Mexico, training these law students how to do trials. And then we bring the champions to San Diego and we train them for a couple of weeks. And then we take them to DC to put on a trial for the State Department and show them, what we're doing. And it's part of trying to build up the justice system in Mexico and improve it. Because, you can change all the laws and all the procedures, but if people don't know how to operate under them, it'll fail. And so we've been doing that. And then the other thing I've been doing, which is a natural outgrowth of my innocence work, is helping develop innocence organizations in Latin America. And now, as you said, I oversee 25 innocence organizations. I'm head of an organization called Red Inocente, which just means Innocence Network. And we have monthly meetings, we have conferences. And the idea is I'm trying to create a pipeline between the United States and Latin America on how to win these cases, how to use DNA technology to win these cases, how to attack forensic odontology, how to do the work that we've been doing up here for a long time. And I find it incredibly rewarding. It's probably the most rewarding thing now that I do with my life, because there's a lot of people doing the kind of work I do here in the United States now. It started with a handful of us 20 some years ago, but now we've got 60 innocence organizations in the US and a lot of incredibly competent attorneys across the country doing this work. But no one was doing anything in Latin America. And so I feel really great that I've been able to create this bridge between our work here in the US and Latin America.
And really shape a continent's worth of effective advocacy, get in on the ground floor, so to speak, and train them properly so that you don't have to untrain poor habits and that mindset of, well, that's the way we've always done it, Justin. So I think that's amazing. I don't know how you have the time, honestly, with the family and all the stuff you have on your plate here, but I'm glad that you do.
Well, I don't do any of it alone. I've got a great team. I've got now 9 people who work for me, and I created this Institute for Latin American Law and Justice at the law school. And so I've got a team of 9 people there who work on all our Latin American programs. And I've got 9 lawyers working for me on the California Innocence Project side. So yeah, I think maybe the thing I've been best at, to be honest, in my career is putting teams together. And I think that's the key to success. I can usually, I was just interviewing somebody yesterday, and people are always taken back by the questions I ask them on interviews, because I really ask different questions. And one of them I always ask is, I say, take me through a typical day in 11th grade for you. And I think you just find out more about people, about what they were doing in high school, about who they are, than me talking about anything to do with their professional career. And when I hear things like, I worked at McDonald's, I hired. That's what I want. People with work ethic, that aren't afraid to work hard. And I look for people who are passionate, and I look for people that I think I'm going to enjoy working with, and that my team is going to enjoy working with. So I'm not bowled over by people's Ivy League credentials or any of this stuff. It doesn't even really interest me that much. I want to find out who they are and how passionate they are about this work. And then I know they'll be great at it.
Yeah, that's a good, I might steal that question in the 11th grade. You got me thinking about what I was doing in the 11th grade. They were long days.
What were you doing? What's a typical day for you in 11th grade?
Wake up when it's dark. I used to have to take, literally, it's going to sound like one of those stories. My kids would probably, yeah, right, Dad. I used to take 3 buses to get to high school, because I didn't have a car. I didn't go to high school in the same city. I couldn't drive yet. And then depending on the season, it was school all day. And then after school, I'd either go to sports practice first, or go to work, or just go to work. I used to work at a Starbucks, number of coffee shops, but towards the end of my high school career, I actually had made it to Starbucks, I think partly because my older sister was a supervisor there. She appreciated my work ethic, but I think I called in the brotherly favor a few too many times for being late, especially on the Saturday morning opening shifts. I don't know why Friday nights were always a little too long. But yeah, no, and then it was take the bus home.
That's an A+ answer. You're exactly who I would hire. And if you think about it, at its core, that is who you are.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't change that much. There's a great series, if you get a chance to watch it. It was first called 21 Up, then it was called 28 Up, then 35 Up, then 43 Up. And what it is this documentarian goes back every 7 years to interview the same group of they were British kids to start with. So he interviewed them when they were 7, he interviewed them when they were 14, and then he put the first movie out when they were 21. And now they're in their 50s. So it's been like this 50-year project. It's amazing. And his principle is, we don't change that much from when we're 7. That's like the concept of the whole series. And it's freaked some of the participants out so much that a bunch of them have dropped out of doing it, because it's just been too insightful and too difficult for them to break away from who they were at their core. And so, yeah, I think people can tell you a lot of stuff. Like I always hate when people ask for writing samples. Like,
Yeah.
I don't need to see writing. You could have had 30 people edit this. I don't know if you can write because you hand me a writing sample. I mean, you really got to dig deep to
Yep.
find out who you're hiring. And my team have been with me forever. I lost one lawyer. She moved to Nebraska and she came back a year later. I lost another one in my Spanish team. She moved to Mexico City. She came back a year later. So I've kept a good team for almost 20 years.
That's good. With the transiting back into the work, I had a couple other follow-up questions. We talked about obviously the expert changing testimony. You changed the law there. We still have the issue of DNA being a big reason for reopening a case. Are you seeing along those same lines now, as the new cases come in, expert testimony or forensic evidence having to do with the wealth of information on cell phones and how that information can sort of prove, credit an alibi or add new evidence as a form of like location of the client based on where the phone was? Have you guys seen a number of those attacks start coming to the forefront or not yet?
Yeah, there's been a sort of evolution in what we look for in cases and what we're finding. When I started the project, in 1999, in most of the states, DNA were like the really great cases. But California was the first state to use DNA at the trial level. And so they started doing that in 93. So it was only in older cases that we could initially even, have any decent chance of a DNA exoneration. And then the other problem was in 70% of the cases we looked at, the evidence had been thrown out. So the first thing we did is worked on an evidence preservation law, which is why I tell every country I work in, first thing is you got to have an evidence preservation law. You can't do any of this work. Then when we saw the different, the new applications of DNA, like mitochondrial DNA came on the scene, and we realized we could do DNA testing of hair samples without roots. When the samples got smaller for DNA, so we could look at old DNA cases that were inconclusive and now get conclusive results. But DNA has not been our big go-to over the past 20 years. There's only been a few of the 34 people we walked out of prison. We did it with DNA science. We have not had a case that we have won based on phone tracking evidence. When that was first came up, we'd reviewed some old cases. The problem was it's still not that definitive. Now, is it great at trial? Yes, because it's a great thing for raising reasonable doubt. If this phone can be shown to be in a different place at the time of the crime, that's a great piece of evidence to add to reasonable doubt. It's not enough to overcome our burden in habeas because there's other explanations. They took his phone and he put it there and then went and did the crime. Is it likely? No, but is that enough? So our burden of proof is so much higher to get these cases opened that we really need it to be super compelling evidence. And it was really tough the first 15 years, actually first 18 years. We only recently last year got the new evidence standard changed in California, and California was the hardest state in the nation to get a case reopened on new evidence. And I know that to be true because I wrote a law review article along with Alex Simpson in my office, and we looked at every statute in the country. And in California, you needed evidence that completely undermines the prosecution's case and points unerringly to innocence. So it had to be absolute proof of innocence. The new standard for new evidence that now is consistent with the rest of the country is if we have evidence that had the jury heard it, they wouldn't have convicted. Still very difficult because, and there's certain subjectivity in that with what a judge thinks versus what a judge is thinking a jury would think. But yeah, we haven't had success in an exoneration due to cell phone triangulation or any of that here. There was a big case in Nicaragua, Eric Voltz, who was an American down there, who was able to prove that he was in another city at the time of his murder using cell phone evidence. And there's been other ones around the country.
That was just a personal question that I had because we see these personal diaries of electronic information in every case now. There's a cell phone download at least. If the client consents unknowingly, usually because they don't realize the passcode, giving them their passcodes the same as consenting to a search of your phone, which is an issue that I have, or they get the warrant. But I mean, we just get so much personal information about somebody of a phone, and a lot of times it's not helpful, at least from a defense
Right.
perspective. Right?
Exactly. It's another one of those things where people talk about, oh, this can be used to exoneration. Like DNA is a prosecutor's tool 99% of the time. 1% of the time it's used to exonerate people. And I think cell phones and recordings, and I mean, the government has so many tools at their disposal to develop evidence they need to convict.
Oh
It's
yeah,
astounding.
Unlimited resources. Is there, we've obviously just had a recent election, and it seems to be a collective sigh of relief as far as, at least with the new president-elect Biden and his VP Kamala Harris coming in. Are you eyeing the regime change, are you eyeing any sort of potential for further criminal justice reform, in the sense of, either sentencing reform, or just, I guess, starting with sentencing reform and trickling down, hopefully, to addressing some of the issues of the systemic racism or the unequal application of the criminal justice process to people of color? Because I see it every day in court.
Well, if you'd asked me that question, 2 years ago, whether I thought Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would be two people for reforming the criminal justice system, I would have had to laugh, because, the guy who created the 1994 crime bill and the woman who spent her career putting people behind bars as being the great reformers, very unlikely. However, when we compare them to the alternative, I was very excited to see them win this election. I don't really see these kinds of reforms coming at the federal level. I mean, the criminal justice system is mostly a state, animal. And just as the federal courts have taken a hands-off approach to state criminal justice, the federal system is a small portion of the whole pie. So I am more optimistic that at the state level, we're going to continue to see reforms to decrease the prison populations. We're going to continue to see sentencing reforms. We're going to continue to see things like the death penalty being abolished, for nothing other than economic reasons. I think it's just got to a breaking point. As we were talking about earlier, we don't have unlimited money in the state budget. So a certain amount of money is allocated to prisons, a certain amount to police, a certain amount to education. And as this COVID crisis has hit the entire country, those budgets are getting tighter and tighter, and their revenues are smaller and smaller. And I think that's where the motivation is going to come from. Criminal justice reform is one of the few issues where conservatives and liberals can come together and, for different reasons, support the same, proposal. So, I testified many times when I lived in Michigan against the death penalty in front of the legislator. And Michigan's the oldest Western democracy with no death penalty. They haven't had it in 170 years. So every time I testified, I only testified about economics. So even though I was up there as, guy who did death penalty litigation, criminal defense attorney, I've got all my opposition based on moral grounds, whether it's really a deterrent, all those things. I just talked about how much it was going to cost and which highways weren't going to get built and which public projects weren't going to happen. And every year they voted against it, and it was economics. So I think we're going to see changes, but I think it's going to happen at the state level. I think it's going to happen due to economics. And hopefully what will lag behind that is the voters who will start to understand what we've been spending our money on for all these years and how little we've gotten in return from it.
Yeah, very little. I mean, it's the war on drugs jumps out as just one of the biggest failures, and harms 360 degrees around that policy, both in governmental waste of resources, ripping people from their families unjustly and causing generational harm to their kids or their communities, specifically communities of color. And law enforcement agents too have also lost their lives in this war on drugs because of misguided policies. I mean, and that's not
just like prohibition. I mean, it's incredible we didn't learn our lesson with prohibition.
Yeah.
We made alcohol illegal, and we had to amend the Constitution twice to make it illegal, bring it back. how could we have not learned our lesson? And we didn't learn it at all. We repeated the same thing 50 years later.
Yeah, and it's still going, and I was worried that if the current Trump administration had kept going for 4 more years, I was really worried with where they were going to try to push sentencing reform on the federal level with increased mandatory minimums, and sort of increased emphasis on filing the most serious and most highest charges with the most exposure or enhancements, and try to eliminate some of that prosecutorial discretion. I was really fearful about that because of these sort of hardline policies and directives that were coming out from the ground up with 1325, zero tolerance misdemeanor immigration laws. We started this whole steamroll process in the federal courts that was just a circus. And a violation of human rights, warehousing of kids, ripping kids from their families, not being able to relocate them with their families upon trying to reunite them and return them back to their country of origin. And it was bad, and it was a nightmare, and we saw it every day. And I was really worried about that snowball continuing to go downhill and then having another wave of sort of when we had in the 80s, the crackdown on crack, the 80s and 90s, with them getting way harsher, black communities getting way harsher penalties for the same crime in lesser amounts than the white drug of cocaine. I mean, I was fearful as a practitioner in criminal defense as to where it could go from a statutory perspective.
Well, yeah, and I mean, look at just think about the fact that the Trump administration is trying to get in as many executions as they can before January. I mean, the deep cynicism, it's just, I don't know, in a country of 400 and some million people with all these things we have going on, and they're like, let's see if we can execute a couple more people before we're out of office.
Yeah.
It's sickening, really.
It's dark. It's really, really dark. I think one sort of wrap up question I have too is, what's your message, if you will, for people who hold themselves out to be tough on crime? You know what I mean? Because the work that you do should be commended and respected, because no one wants to see an innocent person in prison. But there is pushback with respect to, trying to go in there and bring the victims through this again. And there's all these counterpoints to contradict the result and the good work you're doing. And if it was their family member that you were fighting for, you'd be their best friend and their savior, right? So how do you deal with that? And I don't know if you have to deal with it on a personal level too much, or but it's just something that when I'm reading about this, I sort of try to put my other hat on and sort of hear the counter argument so I could know the audience, and whether it's economics or moral reasons, whatever gets me to get them on my side, I try to understand them. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's very hard. I do get calls from victims' family members. They do get onto my social media. I remember, in fact, the Bill Richards case we were talking about earlier, I remember when I first opened the project, I got a call from the victim's sister, and I just thought, oh, here I go. And I pick up the phone, and she says, oh, thank you for taking this case. We never thought Bill was guilty. We tried to get the prosecutor to focus on more investigation. And I was sort of like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sort of relief. So sometimes it's that call, but not as often as it's the call of you're hurting my family. You're bringing up all this horrible stuff. And I hate doing it. We are very, very hesitant to do anything unless we're confident the person's innocent. So like I said, we close thousands of cases a year that we don't pursue. We only pursue cases where there's strong evidence of innocence, or we believe we can develop it, and then we go into that. But I will not have my students just randomly call up a rape victim to say, hey, that guy you said raped you 10 years ago? I just want to ask you about that and whether you're still sure it's him. We don't do that kind of stuff. We only get into cases where we believe there's smoke and where we're looking for fire.
Yeah.
But it is a tough part of the work. And sometimes you can't even, say anything. There's nothing to say. I always think though about Sister Helen Prejean, about that issue and her book Dead Man Walking, that really struck me. And I've had the pleasure of becoming friends with her over the years. We've testified together a few times against the death penalty. And when she was counseling these guys on death row, she had victims' family members saying, why aren't you at my house? Why aren't you counseling me? Why are you just concerned about this person on death row? And her feeling guilty about that. But there's another part of me that says we got to stay in our lane and do what we do. And we also can't be social workers for our clients. I mean, we get people out of prison, and a lot of times they have nowhere to go. And I've had clients live in my house, and you're taking care of all their personal needs now, and you've become a social worker, and try to get my lawyers not to do it all the time, even though I do it myself.
Yeah.
So I think the answer is for us to stay focused, to be sensitive to victims, not be, especially when we know a crime did happen. We just don't believe it was our client. I think we've got to remember that. But still, our clients deserve 100% of our advocacy, and we can't compromise on that.
I agree. And in wrapping up, what are ways people can get involved? I know they can go to CaliforniaInnocenceProject.org, and you can read the compelling work you do, and there's a donate button, and donate money. I encourage you, if you can't donate time, donate money, because that goes a long way in assisting in the case review in furthering these projects. But what are some other ways people can get involved? They don't have money. Are there volunteer opportunities, or how do you suggest people get involved?
So we've got a lot of lawyers who screen cases for us and work with us in that at the volunteer level. And you can see on our website, CaliforniaInnocenceProject.org, there's a section there for volunteers. Right now, we're having trouble in COVID training volunteers and doing a lot of stuff we do in person, but we'll hopefully in the next few months be back up and operating in person in our office. But yeah, certainly volunteering, coming to events. But like you said, money is important, because I've got to raise the money to do this work, and our clients don't have any money. And these investigations, even though we're kind of the best deal around because our law students work for free and most of our services are for free, we still got to pay gas money to drive to those prisons, and we got to pay to get copies of transcripts, and we got to pay experts to testify in our cases. And so we have a lot of those expenses we can't get away from. I'm lucky that, I take no money from the California Innocence Project. The law school just pays me a salary as a professor. And so unlike a lot of charities where you have some very expensive director siphoning off money, I'm not one of them. So you get a lot of bang for your buck. If people are interested in donating, go to CaliforniaInnocenceProject.org and check us out.
I encourage everyone listening to this to do that. One fundraising idea I have, if you haven't done it already, this idea of training lawyers to be investigators is something that applies to every lawyer who handles a trial case, especially in the criminal context. And that's something that I would, if you don't do it already, I would encourage you to do. I'd revisit it with you about putting on, a 1 or 2 day seminar at Cal Western where private lawyers can pay, and we can get public defenders, their organizations can sponsor a group of their lawyers to go, and we could figure out a fee for it. Nothing goes to my pocket, obviously, just wanting an idea that's tangible to my colleagues that we could get some better skills to help represent our clients. And it could be a way to introduce people to the Innocence Project and raise some capital. It's just an idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm definitely open to it.
Yeah, I think that would be a great thing to do with you. And my final question before I land this plane, are you still playing duets of Midnight Train to Georgia?
My singing partner moved to Texas.
I know. I looked at the faculty list. I was bummed.
My old band Blue Room broke up. But yeah, I've just put together for the first of my life a music room in my house. And so my son, when he comes home from law school in a couple of weeks, we're going to set all the amps up, and I'm going to try play some more music. I'm always telling my law students that too. Like, you got to keep these interests in your life. Don't make sure when you graduate law school that 10 years later, the only thing they're saying about you is you're a lawyer. That's something you really want to avoid. You want to keep all the things that make you a full human being alive in your life. So I need to get back to more music.
Honestly, out of all, it's going to sound a little foolish to some, but out of all the amazing work you do, that was probably 2006, and that was my first time really interacting or seeing you in person. You came out, and it was, I don't even remember the event. It was some law school event, and we were there, and you got up there and you guys played that song. And that's why I said to myself, the exact words were, this dude's different. You know, I was a 21-year-old law student, but I was like, this guy's got a story to tell. He lives, he rolls his sleeves up, he gets his hands dirty in, you know, which is sort of like a, you know, almost a taboo topic in this ivory tower of academia. You're in there with people serving life sentences, and this dude's got soul, and he's bringing it through the music. I was like, okay, I see why Justin is Justin now. I get it. You know,
Thank
but
you.
yeah.
I probably will end my career the same way. I mean, I started as a musician. I spent a year playing my guitar in the London Underground back in the 80s, and I kind of imagine myself at the end of my career sitting in some bar in Buenos Aires, banging out, you know, Grateful Dead songs. So I'll probably go back to it.
Let me know when you go. I'll come down there. But I want to wrap it up because I know you got a full day. But on behalf of me, all the listeners, thank you for being a guest on the Never Settle Mindcast. And for everyone listening to this, if you feel compelled to help others, do it. Don't worry about the money. You know, just stay determined. Keep your mindset. There's going to be bad days, but the passion of the cause will carry you through, and you can't let setbacks hold you back. If you don't settle, Justin never settles. He explores all avenues, and when that fails, he gets the law change, and he still brings them home. So thank you, Justin. We appreciate you. Give my best to your family, and I hope you're well.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
So